and find out they're double A for the MTHFR gene, when in fact I would suspect, and this part is beyond my body of knowledge, but I would suspect there are some protective mechanisms and some reasons that that gene persists. But let's say that you do have that genetic risk factor. Well, just like we were talking about with the plant-based diet, there are things that you can do about it. For example, supplementing with a really good methylated form of vitamin B. Looking at your multivitamin and ensuring that rather than it containing something like synthetic folic acid or folate, which is quite common and quite poorly absorbed, that you're instead using something like methyl tetrahydrofolate or a methylated version of folic acid. And so that's one important thing. Monitoring your homocysteine levels to ensure that they're staying in control is another. The issue with the methylation can also be assisted with, again, like having adequate methyl groups, and sometimes that means making sure you've got enough methionine, for example, in your diet. But when it comes to MTHFR, I think probably the biggest things. The other thing that's really important is getting bioavailable folate, and I actually am a fan of using things like liver capsules, for example, or the consumption of organ meats to be able to get some of that. And I think that a lot of the issues with the MTHFR gene can be addressed, and I think that the other issue to pay attention to would be, like I mentioned, the environmental factors that would impair methylation. So I think that especially if you have that homozygous MTHFR status, that you should do things like pay attention to your metal exposure, pay attention to the amount of detoxification that you're doing, whether via the regular use of a sauna or some type of sweating protocol, the regular use of lymph circulating practices like rebounding or walking or exercise. And also paying attention to your exposure to things like mold and mycotoxins, and even testing to make sure that you don't have mold exposure in your home or mold exposure in your office. Just because poor methylation status will impair your ability to be able to detox and also to be able to withstand the exposure to a lot of those issues. And I think another one to pay attention to would be metals. That's another one that, especially with modern dental practices and, brake dust and just living in this post-industrial era, tends to be built up in a lot of people, and people with poor methylation status are going to have a harder time with that. And then one that I think flies under the radar, but often, you tend to see as an issue, these so-called stealth co-infections like mold or mycotoxin or biofilm. Often they're accompanied by a high metal overload. And then the third component that tends to be an issue related to that's talked about a little less frequently is electrohypersensitivity, meaning being hypersensitive to frequent exposure to 5G, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and the host of non-native EMF that we're presented with. Well, if you already have a co-infection, if you've already got metal load, and then you throw electrohypersensitivity into the mix, in someone with poor methylation status, that's all going to be magnified even more. So if you're homozygous for MTHFR, I think mold, mycotoxin, biofilm, metals, and the EMF in your environment are really important to pay attention to, in addition to making sure you're getting adequate methylated B12, methyl tetrahydrofolate, or some other bioavailable form of folate, and then monitoring of homocysteine levels to make sure those aren't getting too elevated.
Speaking of EMF, you're a big fan, as I am, of magnesium. Where does magnesium fit in all this?
Yeah, that's an interesting one with relation to EMF, because we know that a lot of these signals, 3G,